most of us, I think, have spent some time, know Deborah, so I'm not going to go on about the details of her life. But I think that the thing that is most struck me is her incredible ability to articulate what she sees in art. And now I find it and in other people's art. I've been to several talks that you've given and read several papers that you've written talking about other people's work. And Deborah's work has got more narrative crammed into each one of these paintings than almost any other artist that we've had the pleasure of representing. And so I'm very pleased to have you here. I think what we'll do is have questions at the end, and there's going to be lots of time for questions and interaction at the end. So thank you very much for being here and for sharing this wonderful work.
Thank you very much. And I would like to thank you, Carlin, and the staff at Oeno who've put together such a nice show, which I'm very happy with. As you can see, it is narrative work. And I think that my whole life I've been very interested in what's under the surface, what's hidden, what's not being said, what do people think they know or choose not to know. And so what we see has never seemed that trustworthy in a way. And certainly in terms of politics, the question of what's being paid attention to or not, it seems very important to me. So I grew up in the US. I came of age in the Vietnam War. I grew up in the Pacific Northwest, Seattle, Tacoma. And it's very, very beautiful, but it's very, very toxic. In those days, it was a real backwater. It was on the edge of the continent. There was no place else to go. It was lumber and fishing, lots of military bases, lots of smelters pumping lead into the environment, and it was a port city. And the two famous things about Seattle is that the word Skid Road comes from Seattle, because they'd skid the logs down the hill into the bay. And it's the international capital of serial killers. And I just read a book about it that was talking about lead poisoning and serial killing and the smelters. And even as a kid, I remember driving through Tacoma and you could see the arsenic floating down like snowflakes on people's yards. So my own family, we didn't live under the smelter. They were professionals. They were interested in art. My father was very, very interested in Japanese art, and he had books on it, and he made gardens and things. And my mother was interested in painting. She studied painting, but basically got ran out because it was the days of abstract expressionism. And what she really liked was impressionism, that sort of thing. But she liked it. There were books around. She taught me how to mix tempera, that sort of thing. So I did grow up looking at images. They were very present, both Western art, mostly her books on old masters, and Japanese design. So, you know, this was in Seattle and looking at Italian art, that sort of thing. But when I grew up, I fooled around like a lot of kids do, but I think because my mother was so, had wanted to be, she had gone to university for fine arts, but then left because she felt she wasn't good enough. It was very charged for her, and I think I picked up on some of that. So when I grew up, I became a theorist. I went and studied political theory, cultural theory out of archaeology, anthropology, social and political thought. And for my master's in anthropology, and it was considered shocking because I was writing about white people, I wrote a thesis on French Orientalist painting. This was in the early 80s. So French Orientalist painting, you get like amazing people like Delacroix to genre paintings. So the French had gone into Algeria in 1830. It was one of the most brutal colonial wars in history. We're seeing a version of it in Gaza with starvation and stuff. And yet they were painting these idealized paintings, both of like harems, horse races, everything. The head guy of the resistance was a guy named Abd al-Qadir, and French matrons liked his portrait in their salons. So it's weird, you know, it's like the Republicans having bin Laden on their wall. So I wanted to know what was going on with that, that how could you have this paradox? So I began to look at the narrative, and it seemed to me that it was a combination of art and propaganda. It was agitprop in a way. And of course, in those days, we had John Berger, who did the BBC thing, a book and a show called Ways of Seeing, where he talked about oil paintings being like Vogue ads. So they were there to signal status and property and so forth. So it wasn't just the beautiful painting of the apple or whatever. So I guess I always thought of painting as narrative. And for me, verbal language could only go so far. So my father was a bombardier in World War II, and I tried to write his story as fiction. I really tried. I have a manuscript. And at one point, Shani, who, as you know, is a writer, I showed some stuff to her, and she said, "But what is the character feeling?" And I'm like, "Well, how should I know?" Which is not the right thing if you're writing. But with images, I can do it, and I want to do it. So my grandmother there, with her slight self-satisfaction, these nuances of facial muscles and so forth. I can't do it in a sentence, but I can try to do it in a picture. And I find it more interesting that way because writing theory means you're dealing with very abstract concepts all the time. To do images gets you out of that problem and you can actually do something else. So I found it quite liberating. But, I started painting later in life, and I had taught at OCAD for many years. Some of my students were artists, most of them. I was teaching in liberal studies, so showing a lot of work. They'd look at it, they'd see things I wouldn't see. I'd talk to them about their work. And I had a lot of artist friends, but most of them were doing installation, video art, performance, conceptual type stuff. I didn't know any painters. So I had to kind of figure out how to do it. And a friend of mine who'd gone to art school in the 60s said that they don't teach you anything. You just have to do trial and error, see what works, what doesn't work. There'll be many mistakes, but you just figure it out. So for me, moving to the county was very liberating. I had space. I could do that. When I first started working, I made altarpieces. So I would get framing material and have gold and jewels and things, and then have these little scenes of family drama in them. And in the European altarpieces, there'd be these sub-scenes, which is where it happened. So, okay, there's that neighborhood, and then this and that. But then I'd use resin, and I'd be upstairs in the bathroom in my underwear and a shower cap with a blowtorch, and I just got nervous. I thought, okay, I will do oil painting. And you do have to learn. It's not all going to be correct at first. So being here allowed me that flexibility. And it was really, really liberating. So I had to figure out how to do things. And the earliest picture here is that one, and that's called the Nordstrom box. And that's my family, the depressing family Christmas in Mercer Island, Washington, where there were serial killers. And so there's my mother and stepfather, my grandmother, my sister, and my grandfather. And I wanted to get this sense of what a dead zone it was. The tree that was a dead tree with Christmas balls was real. It was my mother's art idea. And there wasn't much, there weren't a lot of cookies and things. But the question I had was, how do I show the disconnection in the work? And that kind of frozen sense, the combination of stasis and tension. How do you do that visually? So this was the first one where I started breaking up the composition. So you can see my grandmother over on the right is kind of off. And then so is my stepfather's arm, it's doubled. And then my sister has different hands, but different, but kind of the same. So it was the first time I thought, okay, I can do that. I can play with composition to try to deal with the emotional timbre of what I'm trying to get across. So that was the Nordstrom box. I think that my mother and if you look at my stepfather's body language, I'm not sure what the scene was, but there you go. And then the next one, as I continued with this idea of fragmentation, which started to feel like something inherent in memory. We all do that. We think of our past, or we think of some past incident, and all these things intervene. It's inevitably jumbled up. So I wanted to convey that a little bit. So the next one is called Sur l'herbe, And it's a group of friends, two of whom are here. And there it's a disconnection, but it wasn't a depressing disconnection. It's more that people were in their own worlds. And I wanted to see how I could show that in the work. So again, I played with composition and relative size. So Amanda's over on the right with her gin and tonic, and she's bigger. And I remember years ago seeing an Inuit print called Fox in Camp. And so you have like the igloos and things, and then this giant fox, and it's because that's what everyone was thinking about. So it was big. So I thought, oh, I can kind of play with that too. And then also, if you look underneath Amanda, there's some sky. So it's the jumbling of everything. Michael, who's reading the book, is floating in space. So it has more to do with my memory and how things can be rearranged and put back together. Of course, there's me on the bottom with a sour face, which seemed to be in a lot of photos, but that is also about how much does one enjoy what's actually happening in the life. So also in that one, it may not be that noticeable, but in my own mind, I moved to more intense color. And that was also, I like color, I want to do color, so I can do what I want. So then, after that, I started thinking a lot about World War II. It's been very important in my life from my family. My father and my mother's father were in the war. They fought in the Pacific. I grew up with this very heroic notion of the US Navy and the Air Force. As a kid, I was weird and always wore a sailor cap along with my father's Air Force pin with the bomb on it. And I just thought there was nothing better than that. So my grandfather was on an aircraft carrier in the Pacific. He was 40 when Pearl Harbor was attacked, but he had a sense of duty, so he wanted to do it. And he was damage control officer on an aircraft carrier that got kamikazed 3 times because he was an engineer in his civilian life and knew about fire and stuff. And supposedly it changed his personality. And after the war, they went to Hawaii a lot. They went every year. And he did have PTSD. He didn't realize it till much later in life, where he I don't know why, but he went to the VA and then they made him write his memoir of life. And he did, and it stopped December 7th, 1941. But, you know, he lived till he was 90 and they went to Hawaii, and it was the Hawaii of hula dancers and Diamond Head and all. But, you know, so this has to do with, like, they were the victors. And we did win. And I have Japanese friends with whom I've talked about this a lot. They lost, we won. But kind of in the end, the next generation has a range of issues that go along with that. So I wanted to show, so that those planes are Japanese Zeros from Pearl Harbor. And I wanted to show how even as old people leaning against the balcony, there are all these things that are still there. He cannot get away from the Zeros, no matter how many years it is. Now my father, who is my grandfather was my mother's father, and my father was my father. So he was 21 when Pearl Harbor hit. And he joined the Air Force and became a bombardier on a B-29. And as a little girl, I could identify B-29s before I could identify cars. I knew all about it. He didn't talk about the war exactly, but sometimes he'd just turn to me and say, "Ever seen your best friend's stomach get blown off?" I'm like, "No, Daddy," you know. And then he'd go back to normal. But he didn't talk about what he did. And what he did was he firebombed Tokyo in 1945. And, you know, 100,000 people died in one night. It was made out of paper, Tokyo. And B-29s flew very high. So what they saw down below were these blossoms of flame, which I try to show in the painting. Now, there's a Japanese writer called Oeno who's done short stories on what it was like on the ground, and it was very different. But he didn't talk about it. He talked about the planes, but he didn't talk about the bombing runs. Once he did, he talked about how the night before a bombing run, they'd talk about the meaning of life, and they'd get very philosophical. But that was it, really. Um, and like a lot of men of his generation who went through war, he drank. A lot of them did. And after my mother divorced him, my uncle, her brother, told her that he'd borrowed a coat before they were married. There was a letter in the coat from this guy and his flight crew, and it was a love affair. And the guy in the flight crew was basically saying goodbye because he was going to go marry a woman. And so Uncle Jim had kept that secret because you didn't out each other in those days. But then he told her, and she told me, and then I went and looked. I have a picture of the flight crew, a photograph, and you could tell immediately who it was, the body language, and that's them. So during the war, he was like the sky pilot, the bombardier on his B-29 doing these runs from, I guess, Tinian and Saipan and stuff over to Tokyo, bombing it, and then this mad love affair with this guy. And then after the war, he was ambitious because his family had lost all their money in 1929 crash, so he wanted to get it back. So he had to marry a woman, and he married my mother, who was a nice girl. And there he is with me in the Pacific Northwest background, and he had to kind of enjoy himself through golf. And that was like a substitute. And here I did the thing of time and space is the kind of, for me, the strongest thing in that painting is the bombings because of the dark and the orange and stuff, like just visually with the color. And even though he didn't talk about it, you kind of wonder if he thought about it or how suppressed it was. Interestingly, he was incredibly interested in Japanese design and art. He told me about it. He created a Japanese garden that was in a magazine with like the elements. My grandparents went to Japan all the time after the war. And so Japan was very much a part of my family, but so was the war. And I don't know about other families if they were so focused on Japan. Like even now, if there are certain things I call things, and they're the Japanese word for it, because that's what I grew up with. Like thongs, flip-flops, we called them zoris, and things like that. So that's from Japan. So I found it very hard to watch the show Mad Men because that was that generation. So yeah, we won, right? So it's after the war. They had to put it all together. It was this massive industrialization. And as I think about the serial killers in Seattle, I just read a book about it that talked a lot about the lead poisoning, and that's what created some of these characters. And the industrialization after the war with smelters, metal plants, freeways with leaded gas, all of this stuff, it was just massive. And these guys had to come back. They didn't talk about PTSD and pretend everything was fine. And obviously there was a cost. So both paintings, I wanted to deal with like simultaneity, the things going on at the same time. And like PTSD is such a human condition. It's not peculiar to this war, but how memory functions in that moment. Okay, but then we get to my generation. And here it's the Vietnam War, and we're the children of these guys. And there was this really great film that came out in 1981 by Margarita von Trotta, a German filmmaker, called Marianne and Julianne. And it's about these two sisters who learn in school about what their parents did and grandparents did. And they're shocked and appalled. And one of them becomes a Baader-Meinhof terrorist and blows people up. And then her own son is attacked. So it's like the violence goes on through the generation. And they're shocked to discover history, and we had a version of that. Like I grew up on honor, the honor of the military. Well, it was not honorable. It was, and the more you dig, the more you learn. So, the litany, like we're dealing with Iran now. Well, 1953, the American overthrowing Mossadegh, Dominican Republic, Guatemala, this place, that place, the next place, that our government was not honorable. As we know. And here, to try to get the emotional tension of it, And I don't know the art word for this. In the photographic word, they're more closely cropped because I wanted to make the heads bigger and things to get more of the tension. So when we learn our government lied, they lied about body count in Vietnam. You had people like General Westmoreland saying things like, we had to destroy the village in order to save it, just this crazy stuff. And for us, we saw what was going on, and our brothers, our older brothers often were being sent over there unless they could get a deferment. If they were from the right class, they might get a deferment for a while at least. So this painting is the famous image from the Kent State. So the National Guard, so LA isn't the first time, the National Guard killed 4 students at Kent State. They also killed students at Jackson State, but they were black, so it wasn't in the news as much. And so this is also jumbling things, all, again, simultaneity. So she's mourning the classmates that were killed. They're all playing guitar in the park like I did. There's the weather guy demonstrating. You know what, Weather Underground. This is the townhouse, and Weather Underground were building bombs, and they blew up the townhouse. And that's the Viet Cong, schematic Viet Cong, because that's what we saw. And when I was in high school, I went out with a Weather Underground guy who taught me karate, because the pig, but it was very much a culture war, and it was very, very divided. Seattle was extremely liberal. It wasn't middle America. And it was intense. But I think it's worse now. And I read an article about that recently, how, we had that. We had a lot of bombs. Weather was bombing everything and constant demonstrations and stuff. But the government in general still held to the rule of law. Nixon held to the rule of law. And now I don't think that's happening. So this was Kent State. That's the 4th of May. And this is the 5th of May. That's the next day. This is Seattle, the demonstration. That's on I-5, the highway. I was there. I was 17. There's the Viet Cong flag. And then I decided to put these kind of semi-transparent Huey helicopters, which were from the war, which we all thought about a lot and think of Apocalypse Now, the at the beginning. And I learned the Huey's actual name was Iroquois, and that really struck me how the name, they're Apaches and Iroquois, like the names of some of these war machines, what they got them from, and it was creepy. So again, it's not fragmented in the same way, but it's kind of playing with some of that. And this is happening at the same time, and this was the hedonistic culture of those days, driving around in cars with friends, getting high. But in the background, there were always these war machines. This is the Mekong River. Like, we knew all this stuff. And trying not to think about it. And again, it's kind of like that now. As I was preparing this talk, Iran's in the back of my mind, I don't know anyone who's there, but it's like, how do we keep in mind different things at once? There's our personal lives, there's what's happening in the world. And I think one reason it's worse now is that there's more surveillance and there's more news all the time at any moment. So that means there's less space. And so the playing, as I recall, when we were playing the guitars in the park, that's all we were thinking about, because we weren't looking at other things. And then finally, I have this one. This is more recent, and this is called All Roads Lead to Rome. And here the fragments are around the edge of the painting. The fragments being the migrants who are going to Italy. I had heard this amazingly sad song from Mali called Lampedusa, and how present it is in Northwest Africa, these people going. And I had just been to Rome, and it is one of my favorite cities. And again, what people see and what people don't see. And I remember when the Syrians were going to Greece, to the Greek islands, some of the tourists were complaining, oh, this is ruining our holiday. And it's like these different realities happening at the same time, and some are quite nasty, I think. So in terms of the migrants, if you're a migrant going to Italy, when there were a lot of, if you were a tourist going to Italy when there were a lot of migrants, the boats are like something you'd see out of the corner of your eye at this very edge. And I wanted to get to that. And the other thing I wanted to get to was this ongoing fascination with imperial Rome. So here we have like the guy dressed up as Caesar. We have the fake centurions. So you can get a selfie taken with a fake centurion at the Colosseum, and then the tourists. And then there's me with my glow-in-the-dark Caesar. But what really struck me is like Caesar was a monster. Rome was a monster. Rome, there were 25 slaves to every citizen in Rome, and they had human sacrifice there. If somebody of any prestige died, they had to have the funerary games, which were basically the arena with people getting killed. That's human sacrifice. And yet, people still say, oh, Rome, it's our ancestor. Well, maybe they're right. But what struck me is in the Roman Forum today, there's the place where Caesar was buried, and people are still making offerings. I saw it with my own eyes. Flowers to Caesar. Why Caesar? He was a monster. So there's still this intense fascination with power and what that might look like. So this one I put myself in. I'm in that one, but because I really was the observer of this and decided why not put it in to just make it more real about what was happening. And so I think that's all I have. Just that this one, I wanted the composition to be more jumbly than the other ones. Buffy?
Who's the woman on the left, and why is she holding the little mannequin?
That's me. Yeah, it's when I was in Rome. My hair, it was humid, right? and it was all over the place. And okay, honestly, I never saw a glow-in-the-dark Caesar, but I've seen glow-in-the-dark Jesuses, and they had them in Rome, of course. So the fetishization of like the Roman Empire, I'm fascinated by it, but in a horrible way.
I want to thank you very much for this, Deborah. Really, it was fantastic, and so thank you.
Thank you.